Hey there, my name is Alexis, and I'm going to show you how I made this bookcase that has a hidden desk compartment that tucks away neatly inside one of its shelves. And I'm doing this build as part of the Rockler Desk Challenge hosted by the makers at the Modern Maker podcast. So before I start the build, I just want to show you what my previous desk setup was. It was just this drop leaf table desk from IKEA that's mounted to the wall. And it comes with a sliding bracket that keeps the desk upright when you want to use it, and then you slide the bracket out when you don't use it. And aesthetically, I don't really like the look of it. I got it out of necessity for work. And I feel like it's very inefficient in terms of the amount of wall space it's using and the amount of space that's not being used. So I feel like making a bookshelf that has additional shelving above the monitor and maybe a third shelf underneath the monitor for additional storage would make this wall look a lot more functional and look more like an actual piece of furniture versus a piece of wood mounted against the wall. So I first started with making the walls or the sides of the bookcase. So I decided to give the bookcase a bit of a taper. So the toppest shelf of the bookcase has a depth of about 6 inches, and the bottom shelf of the bookcase will be about 7 inches deep. And I just did this because I didn't want the bookcase to look too boxy, but I still want to give it function by being deep enough to hold books and pictures and such on the top shelves, but still having more function at the bottom shelves. So once the sides were cut, I put them side by side to make sure they're equal in dimensions in each direction. And unfortunately, they weren't perfectly equal in each direction, so I took my flush trim bit with my router and just trimmed the back sides of the bookcase so that they're equal in depth. Fortunately, only the back side needed to be trimmed. The top, bottom, and the angled sides were almost perfect, that I didn't need to do any touch-ups there. Once the sides are flush, I started working on the shelves for the bookcase, but before I can do that, I gotta find out the angle at which the bookcase is leaning or is tapered. And I did this by using a carpenter square flat against the top of the bookcase, and then I looked for where the 45-degree angle was on the back side of the bookcase. And then once I shifted the front of the carpenter square flush with the front of the bookcase, I then check again to see what that new angle is, and it went from 45 degrees to about a little under 44 degrees. So the angle at which the bookcase tapers is about 89 degrees or 1 degree, however you want to look at it. You can also confirm the angle using trigonometry just by the height of the bookcase and the difference in the depths of the top and bottom bookshelves. So once you figure out that angle, I only cut the top and bottom shelves of the bookcase, and then I cut the components that are going to make up the desk. So in order to have the desk portion fold or tuck away into that bottom shelf is to have it be made up of separate parts, and they're going to be connected using piano hinges. And in order for it to work, the hinges have to be exposed on the top of the desk. So I decided to recess the hinges so that the top of the hinge is going to be flush or below the top of the desk. And I just use a straight router bit to make the recesses, and I did the recesses in 2 passes so that I don't overload the router or potentially damage the wood or the router bit itself in the process. Once the recesses were made, I took the piano hinge and checked to make sure the width of the recess is the same width or wider than the piano hinge. And once I confirmed it fit, I cut the piano hinge to length using an angle grinder and a cutoff disc. And I used painter's tape to help me make sure I cut the piano hinge straight. And to clean the jagged edges, I used the same cutoff disc to just grind off a bit of that sharp edge, and then I touched up the edge with some spray paint. Once the paint finally cured, I installed the piano hinges, and before I install the screws, I always pre-drill holes for the screws because you never know with the type of plywood you're using that there always could be a risk of the plywood splitting on you. And because I made a recess here, the plywood's a lot thinner than before, so I need to be extra careful when installing my screws. And when it comes to using small screws, I always use the power drill to screw it almost all the way through, and then I finish it up with a screwdriver by hand. Once everything is properly tightened, I check to see that the desk pieces are properly aligned with each other, and then I can install the sides of the bookcase. And the way I want this to work is that the middle section of the desk is going to be the face of the bottom shelf, and that face of the bottom shelf is going to be flush with the face of the sides of the bookcase. But I do want to install edge banding, so I want to have the face of the edge banding flush with that face of the desk shelf. So I need to install the edge banding first before I install the bottom shelf. And it's pretty easy to install edge banding. You just need a hot iron to install it and a razor blade to cut off the excess. Since the edge banding is typically wider than the thickness of the plywood you're adhering it to. And when going around sharp corners, I just do a couple light passes with the utility blade so that the edge banding can bend around the other side without completely snapping off. Then once I reach the end, I just cut the rest off with the utility blade. And to remove the excess edge banding from the sides of the plywood, I just use the utility blade again to do very light passes until the edge banding is weak enough that you could just snap it off with your fingers. Once I finish removing the excess, I use 220 grit sandpaper to lightly sand off any rough edges made from the cuts, and then I use the iron one more time just in case the utility blade separated the edge banding from the plywood when I was pushing against it. I also added edge banding to the plywood edges of the desk wherever it's going to be exposed when it's in both the open and closed position. So I even added edge banding on the plywood edges that the piano hinges are covering, because when the desk is in the closed position, those edges will also be exposed. You could cover them up with the shelf, but then that's a whole different design. But I actually forgot to add edge banding at the bottom here, but I will add it later on. Also, the piano hinges weren't affected when I did this. Fortunately, if you want to be safe, I would add the edge banding before you drill the holes for the piano hinges, just to be safe. And if you notice, I actually put edge banding on the part of the desk that's also the bottom shelf for the bookcase. And I did that because if I didn't do that, the desk itself wouldn't be able to close properly. It would actually hit the sides of the bookcase. So I'm essentially using the edge banding as a spacer in this case. So I'm actually going to be using dowels to put everything together, but I'm actually going to start it off with screws just to keep everything aligned first. Then I'm going to slowly replace the screws with dowels as I make my way through the shelves. So my local home center didn't have red oak dowel pins for this application, so I just bought 3-foot long oak dowel and then made dowel pins myself. So I first removed a bit of material at the tips so that I guess there's better entry with the dowel pin. And then I cut grooves using the hand saw so that there will be better adhesion between the dowel pin and the wood piece it's bonding with. And then I cut the dowel into about 2 inches in length, and then I repeated this process about 40 more times because I put about 8 dowels per shelf with 4 dowels on each side. And I know it's probably overkill for the most part, but I wanted to have at least 4 dowels on the 2 shelves that are going to be taking up the most weight, which would be the shelf above the monitor and then the shelf that's holding the monitor itself, as well as the shelf that's holding up the desktop when it's in the open position. So 2 out of the 5 shelves don't really need it, but I don't want to have a mismatched dowel pattern. So I was like, screw it, each shelf gets 8 dowels. And to install the dowels is pretty simple. I use a regular drill bit with a stop collar so that most of the dowel would go in with about a 1/4 inch sticking out so that I can remove that excess using a flush trim saw later on. So my order of operations was basically install the 2 screws outside first, install a dowel in the middle, replace a screw with a dowel, and then either install the next dowel or replace the other screw with a dowel. Then once all 4 dowels are installed, I removed the excess using a Japanese pole saw, and it took less than a minute to remove all 4 dowels. And then at this point, it's just rinse and repeat for all the other shelves. And since I was going to make about 40 more holes like this, I decided to make a jig for myself to speed up the process so I don't have to drill each hole free-handed and making sure that each one's equally spaced all the time. So using this jig will cut that time significantly. And fortunately, the heads of the screws that I'm using to temporarily hold the shelves are almost exactly the same diameter as the diameter of the dowel pins that I made. So I essentially just need to install the 2 screws and then they fit perfectly within the jig. And if you see my builds in the past, there's usually a mistake I always make, and here it is. So at some point I ended up hitting the dowel too hard, and I didn't notice it until after I've installed all the other dowels on this one particular area. And basically the plywood essentially opened up on me. So what I think happened was all my dowel pins are about 2 inches long, and the holes that I drill for the dowels are about 1 3/4 inches. So every time I hit a dowel, there should always be about a 1/4 inch sticking out. And I think some of the cases, they were not going all the way in, So I thought maybe I had to hit it harder when I shouldn't have, because there was probably still sawdust still in there that I couldn't get out when I made the holes in the beginning. So I basically drilled out the dowels, got whatever piece of wood was stuck in between the layers that was causing it to open up, reinstalled new dowels carefully this time, and then hope the plywood won't open up on me again when I reinstall new holes for the new dowels. So when I installed the dowels to plug those holes up, I used regular wood glue, but I think I should have used epoxy because there was a lot more crevices and gaps caused by that split, and epoxy would have went into those cracks a lot better. So I ended up adding epoxy after the fact, even though I probably should have done it in the beginning. But it seemed like everything was working fine. Fortunately, this shelf itself is not going to be taking up a lot of stress. It's going to be on the top, and it's not going to be really going under a lot of weight. So fortunately, I don't have to worry about it potentially opening up or splitting in the future. And once all that was remedied, I was able to continue on with the build. So once the top and bottom shelves were installed, I can proceed with the next shelf, which would be the one that holds the monitor. And I wanted that shelf to be behind the desk, with the top of that shelf about flush with the top of the desk when it's in the closed position. So I use my carpenter square to help me draw an outline for where the shelf should be, as well as its depth. But I realized later on that I probably shouldn't have installed that shelf yet, because the support system that I'm using to install the actual desktop is polyester webbing, and I found out about this material through a video from Small Fry Creations, where she made a picture frame that was also a standing desk, and it's a pretty cool video. I'll leave a link in the description of her video if you want to check it out. And this material is really strong, seems like it's durable, and you just got to cut it to length and then use a lighter or something just to stop the ends from fraying. And I just use painter's tape to help me line up where I'm going to install the holes, and then I just clamp it down before I install the screws, just to make sure it doesn't shift or spin on me as I'm installing the screws. And I wouldn't pre-drill, I'll cause it to fray a bit, and I just drilled the screws through the webbing and it didn't really give me any problems. And if you were to use this material for a similar application, I would leave a little bit extra in terms of length, because I didn't really leave enough for me to clamp onto, so it was a little difficult keeping this tensioned. So before I screwed into the webbing, I just clamped both ends and then had the desk opened up to see how well it held. And unfortunately, the middle section of the desk needed to be supported on its own, but it was no big deal. I had a lot of extra polyester webbing left, so I started working on adding the webbing to the middle section. And I installed the webbing on the middle section first, because if I were to do the webbing on the outer section first, the outer desk section would be going under the additional weight of the middle section, because the middle section is still not supported yet. So the outer desk would undergo more stress because of the added weight. So once I made sure the middle section was tensioned properly, I also checked to see that the desk can still close properly. I installed those screws, and this is when I realized I shouldn't have installed a shelf above the desk before doing this, because I didn't account for the thickness of the polyester webbing, which is maybe a 32nd of an inch. So the angle made by the, I guess, outer desk section when it's in the closed position is different now, because it's lifted up a bit. So it's not going to be properly flat against the shelf that it's leaning against, and most importantly, it won't be perfectly flush with the side of the bookcase. It's not by a lot, but I was hoping I'd avoid something like that. But again, it's not going to be that noticeable, so it's no big of a deal. Then once both sets of polyester webbings were installed, I tested it out to make sure the desktop is supported properly and there's no sagging at all, and looks like it works great. And I wouldn't cut the polyester webbing to final length until after you've applied your stain and finish, just in case you still need something to grip onto before you reinstall the screws. And I intentionally lifted the outer desk a bit when I tensioned it, so that it's not level when it's in the open position and it doesn't have any weight on it, so that when you do add weight, it will level itself out a bit better. My next step is to cut out notches so that I can fit my monitor stand that mounts to the shelf itself in, so that it doesn't stick out from the back. So I use a jigsaw to cut out the notches, but before I do that, I usually drill holes at each corner that I need to make, so that when I reach one corner with the jigsaw blade, I could take the blade out and then reinstall the blade into that hole I just made, so that I can do a clean turn onto the next corner without stressing out the blade. I use a countersink drill bit to start the hole, so that when I use the larger drill bit, it doesn't stray away when I start drilling. You can also use a smaller drill bit as well. I just happen to have a countersink drill bit on hand, so I just used that instead. And after using the jigsaw, there was still a bit of material I want to take off to make it look a lot cleaner, so I used my router to basically trim off that excess, and now the notch looks a lot nicer. I made the notch a little bit oversized for the desk mount, but I didn't want to make it too tight and potentially have it not fit, so I went the safer route and just made it a little bit larger than it needed to be. After dealing with that plywood incident, every time I make a hole for the dowel pins now, I use a flathead screwdriver to basically pry out any remaining sawdust that may still be in there, because clearly the vacuum alone isn't enough, and I was surprised to see how much extra sawdust was still in these dowel holes. But now I was definitely able to get the dowel pins all the way through now, and I'm more careful with how hard I hit the dowels and know when to stop. And at that point, it was pretty much a breeze to install the remaining shelves, and now I can do the final touches on this bookcase desk. One of the last things I needed to do was cut out some more notches for the cables I need to route from behind the bookcase, such as the HDMI cable that connects to the monitor. I'm also putting in a power strip that's going to be inside the desk shelf portion that's going to power the monitor, as well as my laptop and phone and whatever electronics I need to charge. One thing I forgot to mention when I made the notch for the monitor mount was whenever I drill holes into the plywood, I usually use a sacrificial piece of plywood or whatever type of wood you want to use, so that when I'm drilling the hole through that plywood, it's not going to get torn up by the drill bit or Forstner bit or whatever type of bit you're using on the plywood, because plywood is still plywood and the veneers on top are sometimes fragile. And for this particular notch, I couldn't use the jigsaw on one side. I had to use the handsaw because it was a little too close to the wall, but it wasn't that bad. I just used a chisel and then I just used sandpaper to clean it up. Then all I have left to do is sand the piece until it's smooth. I use 220 grit sandpaper usually. Then I can apply my stain and finish, and my stain of choice is usually golden oak. If you've seen any of my past builds that I've used red oak hardwood or plywood with the exception of the Christmas tree that I just recently made out of red oak plywood. The finish I use is usually Varathane poly, but what I've recently been doing for my projects is I would put 3 or 4 coats of water-based poly all over the build, and then on the surfaces that are going to get a lot more use, like the desktop or the tops of the shelves for example, I would put on an additional 2 coats of oil-based poly instead. I'm not sure if that's beneficial or wasteful, but I just thought it might be a good idea. And to actually mount the bookcase to the wall, I'm using French cleats for this. And I just use pine board to make the French cleats, and I make sure that all the screws that are going through the French cleats are going into the wood studs, and fortunately with the spacing of the wood studs for this wall, I'm able to hit 3 wood studs behind the wall. And I made the cleat that's supporting the shelf above the monitor span the whole width of the shelf, and then on the shelf that's underneath the monitor or supporting the monitor, I made a smaller cleat because I couldn't span the whole width this time because of the notch, as well as the clamp for the monitor stand was in the way for me to reach that 3rd wood stud. And to make the cleats less noticeable, I painted the cleats the same color as the wall. I had to paint the wall anyway, so I might as well have done the cleats at the same time. And these definitely hide the look of the cleats a lot better than just leaving it natural or staining it the same color as the bookcase. One of the last things I wanted to do was make a hook for my headphones to hang on. My previous desk had a desk mounted headphone stand and that won't work anymore, so I made one out of some scrap acrylic. I might actually make a separate video for making some acrylic pieces for the desk build, as well as some other projects that I needed acrylic for, so consider subscribing if you want to see me make some random things out of some acrylic. And I've been using acrylic for a little while now, and I like how functional it can be if you know how to work with it, and how it visually doesn't take up a lot of space. So I like that when I made this hook, it essentially makes my headphones look like it's almost floating in a sense if you're looking at it at the right angle, and it doesn't really take up a lot of floor space or shelf space on the bookcase itself, since that vertical space isn't going to be used anyway. And with that, I'm officially done with the build. I like how this bookcase looks like an actual piece of furniture now, instead of a monitor mounted on top of a desk. I can actually put some books here, or some photos, or other things we want to display in the apartment. And I like how easy the desk flips open from the shelf and makes it almost look like a completely different piece of furniture. And I like this little power strip that I picked up for the bookcase. It's nice and compact, it fits behind the desk. I can charge my laptop and has a few USB ports for my phone and my controllers. And some of the tools and materials that I use for this build, such as the edge banding or the Japanese pull saw, I'll put some links in the description if you're interested in where I got it from. So thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. Sorry it was so long. It's involved a lot of steps. Consider subscribing for more videos that are coming along the way. So thanks again and take care.